At first glance, it was ugly, bulky, overweight. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt looked less like a fighter plane and more like a flying oil drum. Pilots joked it resembled a milk jug with wings. Others called it the Jug, and the nickname stuck, half insult, half reluctant affection. But here's the irony. What many saw as a flaw would become its greatest strength. The Jug's massive frame held the most powerful radial engine ever put on a single-seat fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. That engine alone produced more horsepower than some entire German aircraft squadrons could muster. At first, nobody thought such a behemoth could ever compete with the sleek Spitfire or the agile Messerschmitt Bf 109, but history would prove them wrong. Because this lumbering juggernaut didn't just fly, it fought, it survived, and it crushed anything in its path. And in the fields of France, in the forests of Germany, and across the roads of Europe, one day German tank crews would look up and whisper a single word with dread: thunderbolts. So how did a flying milk jug transform into one of the most feared ground attack weapons of World War II? That's the story we're about to uncover. Before we dive in, let me ask you, would you rather fly the nimble Spitfire or the massive Thunderbolt? Comment below, I'd love to hear your choice. The year was 1940. Europe was burning. The Luftwaffe roamed freely over France, and the RAF had barely survived the Battle of Britain. The United States knew it had to prepare. But America's fighter arsenal was weak light planes like the P-40 Warhawk or the P-39 Airacobra. They were fine in dogfights, but they lacked range, power, and survivability. Enter Republic Aviation. Designer Alexander Kartveli faced a challenge that seemed impossible. Build a fighter around the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the most powerful radial engine in the world. The result? A monster. The P-47 weighed over 10,000 pounds, fully loaded, nearly double a Spitfire. Its fuselage was so wide that engineers joked it could hide a jeep inside. Its landing gear looked like it belonged on a bomber, not a fighter. Pilots, seeing it for the first time, laughed. One recalled, "We thought it was a joke. It looked like something from a comic book, fat, clumsy, like it would fall out of the sky." But then they opened the throttle. That double Wasp engine roared like a chainsaw from hell, hurling the Jug forward with unmatched fury. The plane wasn't elegant, but it was fast, tough, and built like a tank. Still, critics wondered, could this flying heavyweight really go toe-to-toe with the nimble Bf 109 or FOF 190? The answer would come in the skies of Europe. Quick question for you. Do you think raw power beats agility in a dogfight, or would you always pick speed and maneuverability? Let me know in the comments. When the P-47 first entered combat in 1942, it was immediately thrown into one of the toughest jobs of the air war, escorting American bombers over Europe. The 8th Air Force was sending waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into German territory. But there was a problem. The bombers could fly far, but the escort fighters could not. P-38 seconds and early P-51 seconds didn't yet have the range. That left the Thunderbolt. At first, pilots complained the Jug could climb, but slowly. It turned like a truck compared to a Spitfire. And in the swirling chaos of dogfights, that mattered. But the Germans discovered something else, something terrifying. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost any plane in the sky. In fact, German pilots joked that trying to follow a P-47 inches a dive was suicide. The Jug was so heavy that once it pointed its nose down, it fell like a hammer. Even the sleek Focke-Wulf FOI 190 risked tearing its wings off if it tried to match the Jug's descent. One Luftwaffe ace later admitted, "If a Thunderbolt dove away from you, forget it. You'd never catch him. And if you were under him, God help you." And then there was the armor. Stories spread across airfields of Thunderbolts, limping home with wings shredded, fuselages riddled with holes, engines smoking and still landing. Pilots climbed out of cockpits that looked like Swiss cheese. Robert S. Johnson, one of the most famous P-47 aces, once took 21 cannon hits from an FW-190. His plane was on fire, controls barely responding. The German ace pulled alongside, shook his head in disbelief, and fired one last burst, then ran out of ammunition. Johnson somehow made it back to England. It became clear. The Jug wasn't pretty, but it was indestructible. By 1943, bomber crews were begging for Thunderbolt escorts. The Jug's presence meant survival. Even if it wasn't elegant in a dogfight, it was a wall of steel in the sky. Here's a question for you. If you were a bomber crewman, would you rather see a squadron of fast, agile Spitfires escorting you, or a wall of armored Thunderbolts? Tell me your pick below. By 1944, Allied bombers were pounding German factories and cities every single day. But there was a problem. You can level a city, but if German tanks and trucks are still moving, the Wehrmacht keeps fighting. Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander, understood this. He needed mobility destroyed. Not just tanks, but the trains, the fuel convoys, the supply depots that kept an army alive. The P-47 was perfect for the job. First, it carried 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. Together, they spat out over 13 pounds of lead every second. That much firepower could shred trucks, half-tracks, trains, and even light tanks. But the Jug wasn't done there. Engineers realized the P-47's rugged frame could carry bombs. Not 1, not 2, but up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, nearly as much as a light bomber. Add to that 5-inch rockets, and suddenly this fighter wasn't just chasing Messerschmitts, it was blasting German armor columns to pieces. Normandy, 1944. Operation Cobra. As American infantry pushed through the bocage hedgerows, German panzer divisions counterattacked. The situation looked dire until the Jugs appeared. Thunderbolts dove from the clouds, unleashing bombs, rockets, and streams of 50 calories fire. Entire armored columns were smashed, fuel trucks exploded in towering fireballs, and German counterattacks dissolved into chaos. One German officer later confessed, "It was not the artillery we feared, it was the Thunderbolts. When they came, nothing survived." The psychological effect was enormous. German troops began calling them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bombers. The very sound of a P-47 diving sent armored crews bailing out before the bombs even fell. And that's when the Jug earned its second reputation, not just as an escort fighter, but as the tank killer of Europe. Let me ask you this. If you were in a panzer crew, would you fear artillery shells or the roar of a P-47 diving straight at you? Drop your answer below. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter, it had become a flying arsenal. With a payload of up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, plus 10 rockets and 8 50-caliber guns, a single P-47 could unleash the firepower of a small artillery battery. Multiply that by a squadron of 12, and you had the equivalent of a rolling thunderstorm of steel and fire. But the true test came in Normandy. When Allied troops broke out of the hedgerows during Operation Cobra, German tanks surged forward to plug the gap. The Wehrmacht had counted on its armored divisions to stop the Americans. But they had not counted on the Jugs. Wave after wave of Thunderbolts screamed down at panzer columns. Bombs cratered roads, rockets tore into fuel trucks, and machine gun fire ripped through infantry, clinging to the sides of tanks. One American infantryman watching from the ground said, "It was like watching the sky itself rip the Germans apart." The destruction was so complete that many German survivors admitted their tanks were often abandoned intact, not because they were destroyed, but because the crews fled in terror. The Thunderbolt didn't need pinpoint accuracy to be effective. Even if a rocket missed its target, the blast could shred tracks, rupture fuel lines, or kill exposed crewmen. And if the bomb didn't destroy the tank, it destroyed the roads the tanks needed to move. By late 1944, German tank commanders reported that a single squadron of Jugs could halt an entire armored advance. The effect was so devastating that many panzer units began moving only at night, hiding under trees by day. But the P-47 pilots adapted. They hunted roads, bridges, and rail lines. They turned every movement of the German war machine into a gamble. And then came the testimonies. Captured German soldiers were blunt. "We fear your Thunderbolts more than anything else." Some even claimed they would rather face artillery barrages than a squadron of Jugs overhead. The flying milk jug had become the iron hammer of the Allied advance. So, here's my question for you. Do you think fear itself was the Jug's greatest weapon or its actual firepower? Comment below. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a machine, it was the pilots who turned it into a legend, and no group embodied that more than the 56th Fighter Group. Led by the brilliant and unorthodox Hub Zemke, the Wolfpack became the deadliest P-47 unit of the war. Zemke understood the Jug's strengths and weaknesses. He knew it couldn't outturn a Messerschmitt, but it could dive faster, hit harder, and take more punishment than anything the Germans flew. His tactics turned the P-47 into a predator. Instead of swirling dogfights, the Wolfpack struck with hit-and-run attacks, diving from altitude, blasting targets, and using sheer weight to smash through enemy formations. Then there was Robert S. Johnson. On the 26th of June 1943, he was ambushed by an .190 Ace. His Thunderbolt was hit by more than 200 rounds of cannon and machine gun fire. The canopy jammed shut, fuel leaked into the cockpit, and smoke filled the air. The German ace pulled alongside, confident Johnson was finished. He wagged his wings, then emptied the last of his guns into the Jug, and still it would not fall. Johnson somehow limped back across the channel. The story spread like wildfire. The Jug could survive the impossible. And then came Francis Gabby Gabreski, America's top P-47 ace. With 28 kills in the Thunderbolt, he embodied the aggressive, relentless style that made the Jug feared. Gabreski once said, "The P-47 was no ballerina, but she was a heavyweight champion. You didn't dance with her, you let her punch." There were others, 2 pilots who returned home in Jugs with wings half gone, or engines on fire, or tails shredded by flak. Mechanics marveled that what should have been wrecks had somehow flown back. One squadron even painted a milk jug on their planes, embracing the nickname as a badge of honor. What had started as mockery had become a symbol of toughness, but it wasn't just in the skies. On the ground, infantry grew to love the sound of the Jug's engine. Soldiers in Normandy said the distinct roar of the double Wasp meant safety, because it meant the Jugs were hunting for Germans ahead of them. Still, there was one question. The Thunderbolt was dominating in Europe, but how would it fare in other theaters, against different enemies, on different terrain? Before we move on, let me ask you, do you think the Jug made its reputation because of its pilots, or did the pilots become legends because of the Jug? Tell me below. By late 1944, the P-47 was legendary among Allied soldiers and notorious among German tank crews. But here's the truth. The Jug's reputation as a tank destroyer is both fact and myth. Let's start with the numbers. A Thunderbolt, armed with bombs, rockets and machine guns, could devastate soft targets, trucks, trains, infantry columns, supply depots. Against those, it was unmatched. But against heavy German tanks like the Panther or the Tiger, things got complicated. Pilots often believed they were scoring direct kills. After a mission, reports might list dozens of destroyed tanks. But post-war studies revealed something surprising. Many of those tanks were not destroyed at all. Rockets, while terrifying, were notoriously inaccurate. A pilot diving at 400 miles an hour had only seconds to aim. Hitting a tank directly was extremely difficult. Yet, the Jug was still devastating. Because total destruction wasn't always necessary, a near miss could shatter treads, rip off external gear, or ignite surrounding fuel trucks. A bomb exploding next to a tank might not kill it, but it could bury it in mud or rubble, making it useless. Even strafing with 50 cals could wipe out infantry, riding alongside, or force crews to abandon their vehicles. And then there was psychology. German crews feared the Thunderbolt not because every rocket was accurate, but because every attack was relentless. Imagine the sound, the shriek of a diving Jug, the whoosh of rockets, the thunder of 8 machine guns. Even if you survived, the stress alone could break morale. One German tank officer admitted, "The Thunderbolts destroyed fewer tanks than they claimed, but they destroyed our will to fight." That was the secret weapon, fear. When Eisenhower later reflected on the Normandy campaign, he said air power, and specifically fighter bombers, like the P-47, was the key factor that broke German mobility. Panzer divisions might not have been annihilated in place, but they were paralyzed, unable to move, unable to resupply, unable to strike effectively. The Jug didn't need to be a perfect tank sniper. It only needed to be an unstoppable hammer. So here's a challenge for you. Do you think the P-47 deserves the title tank killer, or should history remember it more as a supply killer? Comment below, I'm curious what you think. When most people think of the P-47, they imagine it roaring over France or Germany. But the Jug also carved out a brutal legacy in the Pacific. The Pacific War was different. Distances were vast. Airfields were primitive, and Japanese targets weren't always armored divisions. They were dug-in infantry, supply dumps, or naval convoys moving through jungles and islands. And yet, the Thunderbolt proved just as deadly. In Burma and the Philippines, P-47 seconds flew punishing ground attack missions, smashing Japanese supply lines and choking their already fragile logistics. The Jug's ability to carry enormous bomb loads made it perfect for blasting bridges, railroads, and convoys that snaked through jungles. Japanese soldiers learned to fear its silhouette as much as Germans had. Survivors described strafing runs as walls of bullets that left nothing moving. Trucks, barges, and troop columns were torn apart in seconds. But the Pacific theater also tested the Jug's endurance. Missions could last for hours, and island bases meant long flights over open water. Here, the P-47's ruggedness was life or death. Its massive radial engine gave pilots a chance to limp home even after flak or fighters tore holes through its body. One pilot recalled flying 200 miles back to base with an engine coughing smoke the whole way. "Any other plane would have dropped into the sea," he said. "The Jug brought me home. Even against Japanese fighters like the Zero, the Jug held its own. The Zero was agile, but fragile. The Thunderbolt could dive, hit hard, and absorb punishment. If a Zero made the mistake of trading shots, it often didn't survive the first burst of 8 Brownings. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had flown thousands of Pacific sorties, proving it wasn't just a European warhorse. It was a global one, and in both theaters, its reputation was the same: unstoppable, unbreakable, unforgettable. So let me put this to you. Do you think the Jug was more impressive in Europe against German armor, or in the Pacific against Japanese supply lines? Drop your answer below. By the war's end, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 sorties, dropped over 86,000 tons of bombs, and fired millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. It wasn't the most elegant plane. It didn't have the fame of the Spitfire or the sleek mystique of the P-51 Mustang. But ask the men who fought on the ground, and many will tell you the Jug was the plane they trusted most. It was the hammer that smashed bridges, the roar that sent panzer crews scrambling, the steel guardian that escorted bombers across hostile skies. Its pilots became legends: Zemke's Wolfpack, Johnson, Gabreski, and thousands of others who turned a milk jug into a war-winning machine. The Germans respected it, the Japanese feared it, and the Allies loved it. Today, when aviation historians look back, the P-47 stands as more than a fighter. It was the blueprint for modern close-air support. In many ways, it was the grandfather of the A-10 Warthog, another ugly plane that became beloved because it saved lives and destroyed enemies. The Jug wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol, a reminder that war isn't won by beauty, but by toughness, resilience, and sheer, overwhelming firepower. So the next time you see that wide fuselage and stubby wings, don't laugh. Remember that this flying milk jug was feared by tank crews, loved by infantry, and respected even by the enemies who tried to shoot it down. And here's my final question for you. Was the P-47 truly the best fighter of the war, or simply the right fighter at the right time? Tell me what you think in the comments.